Okay, in this lesson, we're going to take a look at the entities we need to create for our application. Obviously, it's based on auctions, so we're going to have some auction type of entities that we're going to create. And listed in the spec for this, we've got our auction class, the item class with its properties, and the status, which is just an enumerable of a few different statuses our auction can be at. And the item is going to be related to the auction. So we're going to have a relationship between the auction and the item, a one-to-one type of relationship. And that's what we're going to create now. So inside VS Code, inside the auction service, I'm just going to add a new folder and call this entities. Sometimes this is referred to as entities, sometimes it's models. I use entities because we're using entity framework, or we will be, and I consider each one of these to be an entity, and an entity represents a table inside a database, and each of its entity properties represents a column inside that database. So we're going to say add new file, and from the C# dev kit we then get presented with a number of templates to choose from, and I'm going to select the class, and then we give our class a name, and the first one is going to be auction. And this creates the boilerplate that we need for a very simple class inside .NET. Now, one of the things this dev kit doesn't do is respect the physical folder property names when we create a new class, which is somewhat annoying. Typically, you would expect this to be inside the namespace auction service .entities when you create a new class using a tool such as this, but for some reason that doesn't happen. But we are using or at least I'm using a preview version of that tool. Now, these are logical things, namespaces, and they do not have to represent the physical location of where this class resides. Now, it's inside the entities folder, but we're inside the auction service. And you can get away with this because we're not going to be creating, in a small project like this, another class that's called auction, for example. If we did, we'd then have a conflict because we'd have two classes of the same name in the same namespace. What you'd typically do is you'd give the namespace the same name as the physical location, even though it doesn't have to be. I will stick with this actually, because that's what I consider to be normal practice, is to just give it the same namespace as the folder name, but it doesn't have to be that way. If you want to keep it simple and just go for auction service, that would be fine as well. But I'm going to update these namespaces to reflect the physical location. So let's go ahead and create the properties that we need inside this class. And each entity needs to have an ID property. I'm going to use GUIDs for this, and it's going to have a GUID which is named ID. Now, if you've not used Entity Framework before, then Entity Framework is convention based, and when we call a field property ID, then this is what it will use as default for the primary key of that table. And then we'll just create the other properties we need. So we just need an int for the reserve price. And notice what we get here. It's kind of grayed out on here, but we've got some suggestions from one of those extensions we've installed, the C# dev kit. And we've got something that's referred to as IntelliCode. And it's going to try and make a guess using artificial intelligence about what we might want to put there. And we can accept it by using tab if we want to. And this is actually really helpful because it can really speed you up. Especially if you're a slow typer like myself, then you've got help now to kind of autocomplete code. Be careful with it, but it's coming from this extension. When we installed when I installed, let's just go remove the search, but when I installed the C# dev kit, this also installed an AI assisted development thing that helps with auto completion inside our code. Don't have to use it. I'm going to use it for a while anyway and see how it goes. I don't typically use VS Code on a day-to-day basis. I typically use Rider. But that's a subscription-based tool, and I don't want to demonstrate writing code on anything that you have to pay for, especially when the free stuff is so good anyway. And this is quite helpful. It's probably going to help speed up writing the code, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. And next we'll have a property that's for a string of the seller, and this is optional, we won't give it a default value, but once we have identity, we'll be able to retrieve the information, the seller username, from their user that they authenticated with. Then we'll have a string for the winner, and we'll have an int that's optional for the sold amount. We'll have another int, again optional, for the current high bid. We'll have a date time property, and this is going to be for the created at, and we'll give this a default property of date time and not .now. We're going to go for UTC now. And the reason for UTC is it's a standard international time format, and UTC is the same anywhere in the world. And the second reason is the database server we're using is Postgres, and that insists that we use UTC values for the date time. So that's fine. We'll also have a date time property for updated at, and this again is going to be initialized to date time and UTC now. And we'll also have another date time property, and this is going to be for the auction end. And we'll also have a property for the status called status that we do not have yet, but we'll add it anyway. And then we'll also have the related property for the item. Again, we don't have yet, but we'll add that in here as well. So a couple more things to create. Go back to Solution Explorer. Inside Entities, I'm going to create a new file for the status. And I need to say, first of all, select enum, and then call it status. And once again, I'm just going to update the namespace here to entities. And we'll just have a few statuses inside here. The auctions can be live, they can be finished, or they can be over, but the reserve price or reserve not met. So those are the only statuses our auction can be in. Obviously, when an auction is live, that's when it can accept bids. But when it's finished or reserve has not been met, then the auction is no longer available to accept bids on. And then we'll create another file, and this one's going to be a class, and we'll call it item. And inside here, we'll have item properties related to a car. Now, the item is going to have its own table in the database, and that means it needs an ID property. Again, we're going to use a GUID and call it ID. We'll have a prop of string for the make. We'll have a prop of string for the model. We'll have a prop that's an int for the year of manufacture of that car. And we'll have a prop that's a string of color. And I appreciate I'm from the UK, and colour is not spelt this way in the UK. It would be colour with a U, but I'm going to go for simplified English, American English, because two reasons. One, that's probably what most of the planet uses to describe colour, and also it means one less character to type, and characters add up. So I'm going to take advantage of that spelling. We'll have an int for the mileage, and we'll also have a string for the image URL. And we're going to add some properties to define the relationship between our item and its related item, which is the auction, or related entity, which is our auction. Now, we've got a definition for the item here. Entity Framework is convention-based, so it's going to recognize that if we've got a property called item, then this is related to the entity called item. But if we want to fully define this relationship, this one-to-one relationship, then we also need to provide the related property from the other way as well, so that we fully define this one-to-one relationship. Now, we can do this via configuration, but we can also do this via convention. So I'm just going to put in nav properties, that's what these are referred to as, and we're going to have a property for the auction and call it auction, and we're also going to specify the GUID, that is the auction ID. And this is just a related property or a navigation property, so the Entity Framework, when it configures the schema for our database based on the code that we're writing, it's going to set up this relationship as we want it. So now that we have our entities created, what we're going to take a look at next is creating the entity framework class that's going to allow us to make a session between our code and the database, and we'll take a look at that next.